together around urban living labs.
We're just given a minute or two and then we can get started.
Actually, I think you should put some other light because through this call, it's going to become dark here.
Sure.
Just realized.
Yeah, got it.
We're just around winter, around the corner here, so it gets dark by 5:50.
We're just giving it a few more minutes. We had like 75 registrations, so hopefully a few more people will join.
Sure.
About 17, 18 have joined. So Shani, let me know when to kick it off.
Yeah, I think in another minute or so, we should get started in the interest of time. So we want to, so why don't you get started? People will continue to join in.
Okay, great. So yeah, just a quick welcome from me. I'm Vikram Mathur, and I'm the Director of Transitions Research. We think of ourselves as a social science research collective, and we conduct multidisciplinary research to generate anticipatory knowledge on complex interplay between technology, society, and sustainability. The focus on kind of the idea of transitions is that we are kind of focus on four radical shifts that are currently shaping our world, where we see shifts in human values, in politics, in socio-technological systems, and our aim is to kind of conduct social science research to shape these transition pathways. So that's like very broadly what transitions research is seeking to do. The four transitions that we are currently focused on as an organization is low carbon society, future cities, digital society, and the future of food. And talks on transitions today is in some sense linked to the work that we are doing on future cities. I mean, I'm not going to talk much about the kinds of urban transitions that are taking place in India, but certainly there are statistics to suggest that India is going to be largely urban, and a lot of the urban development is happening in small, mid-sized cities. And our Future Cities program tries to think about can we make sure that the transitions that are happening in the context of cities are inclusive, climate resilient, and technologically smart. And obviously, I mean, the idea behind today's dialogue was that, I have been working in the climate adaptation resilience space now for over 20 years. And I was just speaking to my colleague Ashali that initially when we started thinking about adaptation, it was a lot of people who were from the field of kind of hazard planning, and they used to map out kind of vulnerability to particular climatic events, and even gender was considered in a very kind of superficial way. Gender conversation was always alive in the adaptation debate, but the way it was addressed was in a very superficial way. Consequently, we see that a lot of the impacts that the cities are now facing as a result of climate change have really strong gender dimensions. So the idea behind the conversation today, and in general, the research we are doing on gender and climate change in cities, is to think about and reconsider the roots of our societies, and to think about transformative adaptation, and that needs to be holistic and thinks broadly about the economic, political, ecological, and cultural determinants and causes of vulnerability of women, and tries to kind of get to the fundamental attributes of the system that is creating these differentiated vulnerabilities. And obviously, I think it comes down, as we have seen, as we will see in our conversations, a lot to power relations, and to kind of entrenched norms and practices that disempower women and limit their coping capacity and adaptive capacity in cities. So I think that's the kind of broad framework. My colleague Ashali, who's an urban planner and leads the future cities research at Transitions, will talk a little bit more about how we have framed this dialogue. And then we have three really illustrious panelists, and I'm going to take a few minutes to just introduce them before I hand over the mic, so to speak, to Ashali. First, we have Sheila Patel. She's the founder and director of the Society for the Promotion of Area Resources Center, an NGO that has been working since 1984 to support community organizations of the urban poor in securing housing and basic amenities and rights to the city. She's widely recognized nationally and internationally, and sits on the board of various organizations. And Spark, her agency has also been working in alliance with two community-based organizations, National Slum Dwellers Foundation and Mahila Milan, that are active in 70 cities in different states in India. Then we have my friend and colleague, Dr. Divya Sharma. Divya Sharma is an international climate and urban development expert, and she's currently the executive director of the Climate Group in India, and has worked a lot on urban planning issues and various capacities as a thought leader, knowledge communicator, researcher. And last, and definitely not the least, we have Dr. Kalpana Vishwanath. She's a researcher and practitioner on gender inclusive urbanization and mobility. And she's the founder and CEO of Safety Pin, which is a social enterprise that uses technology and data to advocate for safe urban spaces for women. Safety Pin has worked with cities and consulted with UN Women and UN Habitat on research studies on safer cities. And she's a member of the advisory group on gender issues at UN Habitat. So with that, I want to hand over the kind of conversation to Ashali, who again, as I already introduced, is an urban planner and kind of does both really practical work on cities and actually designing plans for gender inclusion and gender safety. She's done some amazing work in Panjim, but also is a researcher and thinker. Ashali, over to you.
Thanks, Vikram, and thank you everyone for being here and joining us today. Just before I set the context a little bit more for the dialogue, I just wanted to let the participants know that we will be having a Q&A and open dialogue in the latter half of the session today. So you can use the Q&A or the chat feature to voice your questions. And then later when we have an open discussion, you can also raise your hand. I'll be happy to unmute your panelists. So building off of what we talk about conversation today. It's World Cities Day. It's celebrated every year on October 31st to raise awareness and promote the importance of addressing urban challenges around the world. And in India, much of our cities haven't even. The 2018 revision to the World Urban Prospects suggests that by 2050, we have to accommodate more than 400 million new urban dwellers in our cities. And we must do so in a sustainable and equitable manner, which means addressing power dynamics and social inequities that have led to the stark differences in quality of life for certain communities, especially girls and women. And when we think about the other emerging risks we face, for example, the uncertainty of climate change, we know that this year alone, our cities have witnessed devastating floods, unprecedented heat waves, and acute water scarcity. And these risks, plus many more, are only likely to intensify. And the impact of these challenges are not evenly distributed. Studies show that women are more likely to die during extreme heat, and they're less likely to be able to access relief post different disasters. And this has repercussions for their education, for their livelihood, for their health and their well-being. So it's clear that we need to reimagine what our future cities should look like. And we want to begin that conversation today, or continue that conversation today, by talking about resilience and inclusion. Like Vikram said, at Transitions Research, we take a gendered perspective to much of our work. And while thinking about the future of our city, we place great importance on how and why women have limited access to opportunities, and how and why they're disproportionately impacted by emerging risks like climate change. We ask, what kind of transformations can city planners and urban decision makers enable to address these structural biases and these entrenched norms and values? So today we're fortunate to be in conversation with the three distinguished panelists that Vikram has already introduced. And so in the interest of time, I'd like to just kick things off. And I'd like to ask, by starting all three of our panelists, to give us a quick background about your work and how your experience has addressed gendered challenges in Indian cities. Maybe Divya, we can kick off with you if that's okay. You have 5 minutes and I'll be watching the clock. I'll let you know when we have 1 minute left and let you know when time's up. Thanks.
Thank you, Ashali, and thank you, Vikram, for having me here. I will just give you a brief background about myself. I'm an architect and urban planner, and Vikram has already spoken about my work. But especially what I have done in the past 20 years is work around different elements of sustainable urban development, and then graduating, if I may call that, from sustainable urban development to climate resilient cities. And in that perspective, I've worked across smart cities. I've worked with many cities who were not smart cities, were part of the other national level schemes of the government of India, like the Jawaharlal Nehru Urban Renewable Mission, the BUSP, Amrit kind of schemes. And I have looked at how urban development in India in the past 20 years has changed, but the problem and have actually what we were always and already grappling in the early. I as a young researcher and I saw that specifics and how migrations should be collected. And then very quickly around the years, it moved from the fact that should be collected to the fact that should be organization accept. And we, Ashali just gave us how we will be more urban than anything else. But what I have seen is, and particularly talking about the gender to urban planning, the perspective of gender to climate resilience, is that we have had a very unidirectional view to planning for women or planning for gender. And the other problem that I have seen is um, we have to oversimplify this complicated stage of urban development, urban planning, so to say, which has actually led to the stage not talking about society, not talking about community, but we are talking about infrastructure. We are talking about how we will big mega cities, technologically systems. In a, if we look at it at a granular level, we see that there inequity, there is which we have not been able to tackle, and some of these big interventions have not the simple answers to simple problems of life, pollution, water, basic services, electricity, to say, and we are still grappling with some of these issues. So that is something that concerns me, and something I tried to look at when I was working with city, to say, and also we are below that and up in terms of their size and their, and with you that I have I
Thank you, Divya. Can I ask next, please?
Okay, so I'm from almost the opposite location that Divya started. I'm a grassroots activist. I started working with communities living on pavement in the district of Baikala, which is near the old port in Mumbai, as the largest number in the pavements. And that has actually and given me a perspective which is very special and unique, which is you had from the 1970s a huge influx into the city. In the fact that the 40s has actually encouraged people to come into the city, textile mills, built houses for them till they needed that many people, and then decided to stop. What we saw when we worked on the ground is that you had people who to live on the pavements, different open spaces they squatted on for almost a generation. Not only also assume that people are, they are sometime, because they are, there's no compulsion on the city and its land statutory the challenges that they face, as a result of which, on the larger scale of national government is in constant denial and the acceleration of real urbanization. The 20 census had 2,000 what would be certified as towns. The city, the government's rural and subsidies, far what you will get if you get city or a town. So you have 1,000 census towns in 2011 that were still called rural. So you have a large system in which, by the way, it's not, there's propensity for development researchers, practitioners, and believe that well in rural areas not have urbanization. This is a 50-year-old development that if you dig deep into everything, you have NREGA, you have rural health missions, everything like that, but you don't have a number. So people who come into the city are bad, but in the village are virtuous and need institutional assistance. In fact, also does not work. Then you have a situation if you look at land in the cities, it was defined by colonists on the basis of their extraction strategies. So you had where the elite lived, you had the finance center, you had workers, and then you had large amorphous working force that served your needs, but whose obligations you did not take on to look after them. And so each generation, each decade, the densities of these neighborhoods, the deficits in requirements of water, sanitation, basic amenities and services so exponentially that even if Excel sheet and did simple calculations, it was far beyond what the city could do. And so it was a vicious cycle of this increasing, but the costs increase, the experience not being there, the right things, and then a span of something which was provided one here, one bit there that happened. This is the backdrop that to first of all, it's the JNNUI, whether it's the all these pithy words, smart thing that you talk about, are all superficial experience of political administrative way touch the lives of the bottom 40% in the city. So then the issue of gender in context, then whatever you do is not enough. It is cute, it is very worthy, but scales necessary to be transformative. And I think that is the basis of development challenge, which now is exacerbated with the fact that extreme is lives of poor people triple, because deficits in development exacerbate what climate does their vulnerability. It also impacts their transport, their wage earnings, and all this together is actually producing a depletion of capacities and resources general in the environment. And somehow in research practices happens that people look at the top 5% of people living, everybody living in the same. So if you take the 5 to 10%, they can get bank loans, they can move out of the system, and there's that volume large enough for everyone to give attention to them to say, let's pick the low-hanging fruit. Now, the reason I'm saying all this too is that if you don't locate the challenge within this context, then you cherry pick, street, the other wish, and then you out it. But there's that you can do, because this is in this large vulnerability. Whether you take the police, now if you talk about safety, work on safety pension. The point is, there is not even % police presence in settlements if you took ratios. There is not any woman or person in the slum who to a police station and give any complaints. So it's like the whole governance structure has collapsed for poor people, and they are just vote banks and all those kind of things. Now, within this context, my work has been to create networks and organizations of poor communities centered around women's collectives. Because in informal settlements, women are the managers of those settlements. They manage the dealing with scarce water, they deal with coping with arguments and fights, they cope with their homes, they work. So, but they are never recognized. So when you get an external, either you or me go there, you'll have 5 men who come out and tell you how they want, what they want, what they want everybody else to do. But you will never have women who come up and say anything. So our process is that Mahila Milan, which is this network of women's collectives in the informal settlements we work, they go through an exposure of understanding how the city works, what are the roles and obligations of duty bearers to them, be they the police, be they the rationing system, maybe the health center, everything, so that the evidence that they gather for what they require and how it needs to be done is started by them until the point that they get it. Because in reality, no project can deliver anything more than a pilot. But if you invest in communities and persevere, then the chances are that those solutions become accessible over a period of time, and then they get multiplied. And that's been our experience. What we find is that it's when women work collectively and have the resources and the confidence and the support to renegotiate relationships with traditional leaders in their own neighborhoods, with the politicians, with the bureaucracy, that they begin to transform the way they look at themselves and their ability to protect themselves, their children, especially their young girls, and their neighborhoods gets transformed. So it's a very slow, grinding, hard space to work in, but it is one in which there is transformation. When it comes at scale. And I can give you many stories. We've written a lot about it, but I come from that point of view. And for us, development with a climate lens is the way we look at what we want to examine, what choices we want to make, and how we want to move ahead. Because we believe that for the longest time to come, state institutions and national and international resources are not reaching anybody. Divya, you spoke about JNNURM. It was, along with Brazil, one of the largest allocation of money for urban areas. It has not even given 4.5% of urban dwellers in the 63 cities a house or an infrastructure. And 50% of the houses that were built are still unoccupied. I used to be on the Prime Minister's committee. Now you can imagine that whether you are sitting there, the systemic crisis is so deep. And therefore, looking at how we look at national programs and how we need to flip them to make them work for poor people is really the challenge that I think those of us who work on the ground and seek to take these voices to different spaces on. I hope I haven't taken too much time. Sorry.
I think that was excellent. I'm stepping in for Ashali, whose internet is...
I'm back, Vikram.
Oh, she's back. Okay, Ashali's back.
I'm back. Yeah, I've had some electricity and internet issues. But Sheelaji, thank you so much. And I think you've answered some of the questions that I wanted to get into or started to scratch the surface. So before we get into the big questions, Kalpana, would you mind quickly introducing yourself so we can get into a bit of a discussion?
Thank you. You know, my entry and my sort of standpoint in this entire work and debate is similar and different from both other speakers. Really, like in Mumbai, where the whole issue of the slum dwellers or the street, this thing. In Delhi, in the early 2000s, there was a big move to relocate all the low-income and slum housing out of the center of the city. I was at that time the director of Jaguri, which is a women's organization in Delhi. And really, it was at that moment that this whole issue came to light for us, because as women, as families were dislocated from the center of the city and really thrown to the peripheries with no infrastructure, no services, no mobility options. And we had been working with the women in these communities when they were in the city. They were doubly, triply disadvantaged. From one was many of them didn't have papers to get another housing anyway, but in that women lost their occupation and employment much more than men. Women were unable to move around the city because once they were further away, there was a lack of public transport, and there was lack of the public transport was more expensive. So that was really our entry point to saying the city is actually a very hostile space for women. And over time, can you hear me? Am I frozen?
Yeah.
Or is someone else frozen? Yeah, okay. Shali keeps getting frozen from her. So
sorry, it's my
yeah, so problem. So therefore, the work that we've been doing, I mean, first as Jaguri and then through a lot of work in Delhi and cities around the world, and then with Safety Pin, is really to underpin this kind of this entire sort of that urban plan, urban services is somehow gender neutral. We have realized that it needs to be unpacked. It needs to be unpacked for the extremely biased nature of it. It's urban mobility, urban infrastructure, it's services that are provided. In addition to what Sheila was talking about, certainly the in the city, and certainly the low-income neighborhood in Delhi, the resettlement area, face tremendous challenges of the lack of basic services, essential services, as well as services for gender-based violence. But it is women who carry this burden most. And therefore, women's experience, I think, underpinned by two very sort of fundamental ways that they experience a city. Number one is the care economy, whereby largely the work of care, which is the work of the everyday sustenance of the urban economy, is has devalued and is unpaid. And the second thing is the issue of fear and violence. Fear and violence structures women's access to the city, whether it is something like catching a bus after dark, whether it's going to a community toilet, whether it's having to go open defecation, whether it is trying to walk in a park in the evening, and the range of things. So at Safety Pin, really what we've tried to do is to unpack this by really auditing, by sort of looking at spaces in the city, looking at mobility, and saying, what is it? What are the different parameters we need to address? And like Sheila, we've also realized that, you know, governments are often willing to address the so-called low-hanging fruit, which is, you know, fix a light, do something small, do some placemaking exercise around one metro station. This gives them visibility. But really, we recognize for a gender transitive kind of cities, we need to address the broad areas of infrastructure and the nature of the public space, the entire area of services, whether it's water, sanitation, as well as response to violence, because that's another extreme experience of the city, whether it is a continuum of violence in the private space, in the public space, at the workspace, institutions, and really defining this broadest sense. We use things like the fact that lack of good toilets in public schools prevents girls from, accessing opportunities for education. And finally, the ability to be mobile, because really, what is it that we do in a city? We move around whether it is for occupation, employment, whether it's for in education, whether it's to take the care work, and really a very distant reality for women's lives for any kind of leisure, to be able to move. And we know that mobility in our cities, like most infrastructure, has been designed for an able, so even the height of the, the thing that you hold in a train or a metro is person, woman. It is designed for the average male and able-bodied. And I would add often cis and heterosexual, because it also presumes that the entire care work is done invisibly. So, you leave in the morning, there is a rush hour at 8 in the morning and 5 in the evening, without recognizing that the patterns of mobility of women is totally determined by the care economy. And if the one thing that COVID unraveled for us was that how central the care economy is to our urban economy. And I really hope that we will be able to build on that and not just go back to business as usual and continue to invisibilize that. And therefore, I'd just like to end by saying that in the context of urban resilience, in the context of climate change, in the context of a whole range of whether it be natural disasters or man-made, and there I will continue to use the word man, it is the fact that the burden that falls on women, the burden that falls on poor women, is what we need to keep at the center of all the work that we do. And there finally, that I think the fact that all of us, the kind of work we can do, at the end of the day, it is constantly to have to push, to advocate to the government to mainstream this, because we can do something, we can make certain change, we can change one neighborhood, but at the end of the day, unless there is a true gender transformative mainstreaming of some of these issues across municipal and national government, we are not really going to see changes that will make a difference to the life of really the most excluded person in our cities. And I think if we begin by recognizing the intersectionalities, and I would really like to say that we must see, and we certainly recognize that all women do not experience the city in the same way. So we also need to unpack that intersectionality and difference in order to really have a meaningful conversation, but also meaningful change, which will impact the lives of women. Thanks.
Thanks, Kalpana. I think you touched on a really interesting point, right? That I think has come across in all the presentations, and the fact that we need to kind of center the marginalized, vulnerable communities, and we need a transformative approach. And all of three have come from different backgrounds. But Divya, I'm going to come back to you, right? You've worked directly with policymakers, with city governments, right? Kalpana's highlighted the need and the urgency for this transformative approach. As we think about the mandate of cities, what they can do, possibilities and powers they actually have, right? What do you think that local governments should start doing? What are the first steps they need to take to address these really deep-rooted and structural challenges, to come up with actual transformative approaches, both to improve gender equity and while thinking about climate risk?
Thank you, Aishali. Yes, good question. I think there are three basic things that I would like to discuss here as a response to your question. One is the fact that we've spoken about the fact that we need more participation from women. We want a lot of women to be part of the decision-making process. But when we speak of women participation or in decision-making, we need to ensure that the participation is enough, one, and that they have spoken enough to make sense to transform policy or design. So what we do at the moment is that it's very symbolic the way women are included in the decision making, or women participation, even in terms of community participation, is taken into account when we talk about urban planning. Smart cities was one of the schemes where a little bit of participation from citizens and not so particularly from women was taken. But I don't think that was enough. And that is my question, that we have to, one, make sure that the participation is enough, and two, we have to make sure that the gaps are highlighted enough for the policymakers, for urban planners, for urban managers, to make sense out of it, to understand the lived experience of women, of girls, of children, different genders, to be able to come up with policies and design that will actually make some difference in their quality of life, in the way they maneuver their day-to-day activities, starting from their household jobs, access to water, electricity, etc., even accommodation, towards moving to their workplace, taking their children to school, bringing them back, and their different activities, including leisure. That's one thing. The second thing is, so basically understanding women's need is crucial. The second thing is that we have to cease to look at this problem, particularly the problem of gender inclusivity, in a unidirectional way. So what we have to be doing is that, as Kalpana ji was saying, and even Sheila ji spoke about, that we can't cherry pick issues. We have to, at one point of time, look at it holistically, and we'll have to see that there are institutional mechanisms that are rooted in gender requirements, in the demands of different genders, particularly women and the vulnerable. Why I say this is because urban planning itself is a complex process, if at all we have one. Urban management is even much more complex. But either of them cannot survive if they are not working well for their population, for the communities. Ultimately, what we have read as urban planners, Ashali, is that theoretically the cities should allow you to work, live, and play. But if the cities are not giving you the basics, and if you feel vulnerable, if you have to fear at every step, then there is something really very wrong. And that needs to change. And that can only change if we look at this problem in a multi-directional way. Resilience itself, and we've worked together, Achali and Vikram, is an intersectional concept. And that needs spotlight to all components of diversity, whether it be gender, whether it is about the vulnerable group, whether it is about disadvantaged section of the population. And this has to be an approach which includes all. It also has to be an approach where different subject matter experts come together and think about the problem in a holistic way. So you can't think about, like an urban planner, only when you are talking about how would a particular infrastructure be located in a specific area and how would it operate. It should be, there should be a thought process about what will be the socio-cultural impact of that particular infrastructure, what will be the economic impact of that infrastructure, and whether that infrastructure will be useful and usable to people like women and girls. The third thing, and lastly, is about the fact that when we talk about women folks, it has a lot of socio-cultural underpinning. So urban planning, urban management, things like climate resilience, they will have a quick turn towards how socio-cultural aspects will play when it is about women, for example. So for example, you build an infrastructure, and there is a responsibility of the urban management or urban local body to maintain that infrastructure. And urban planners, urban managers, or urban decision makers would have the lens of that infrastructure coming into fore. There must be timeline, there will be a project that will be designed around that infrastructure. And then once it is handed over, there will be the maintenance issues. What we are not looking at is how will that infrastructure be used and by whom, and what will be the behavior around use of that infrastructure. And that makes and breaks how the vulnerability increases around that particular infrastructure that was introduced in one part of the city. Similarly, about parks, Kalpana ji was talking about parks, she was talking about mobility. All this infrastructure It all boils down to what kind of infrastructure is being provided in cities, women use, and whether they feel safe or not. My personal experience is that I have to take 100 decisions before to look at time, to look at how will I maneuver that distance, what is the mobility, direction that I will take, whether I will use public transport, whether I will not use public transport. All these decisions for us like me, and there are several hundreds and billions of women who are doing the same thing. It does not come as easy to you. So basically, we need to look at these broader issues, that they are multidimensional, that we have to ask the right questions, and we have to give something that is usable and that takes away the fear, gives freedom to move about the city and do the work that we want to do. Thank you.
Thanks, Divya. Building on those points, right? Kalpana, when you gave your introduction, you talked about safety pin, right? And I'm wondering, when we're talking about these urban infrastructures, right, making them more accessible, safer, kind of centering women, girls as the users of these infrastructure, right, instead of traditionally thinking about able-bodied men. What do you think the role of technology is, right, in actually improving women's access? And how do we ensure that it's used responsibly? And, I know we're running short of time, so I'm going to trouble you to be a little bit brief if that's okay, right?
Sure.
But I'd love to know more. What your thoughts on that?
Yeah. No, I think, technology has to be seen as, the problem is technology is often seen as the solution. And I think that is where we are, we struggle to really deliver what is needed at the grassroots, at the community level, and to women. Now at Safety Pin, we have taken decision to work with technology because we also feel, how do you harness technology? Is there something such as feminist technology? Is there ways that we can actually do this? And I think, I'm very well aware, all of us, the digital divide. Even the most recent study has shown that while, smartphone usage, smartphone ownership, internet usage is slowly increasing, even for women. The latest studies are showing that, it's about 26% adult women with smartphones, 30% adult women using the internet. The NFHS has also shown that more than 50% of women own mobile phones, not necessarily a smartphone. Now, having said that, we need to recognize that with this digital divide, what is it that we ensure that the digital divide does not further disempower women? So what we've really done in Safety Pin is we have an app, we have technology platforms, and it is used globally. Recognize that it is a way that you can enter data. You can actually talk about your experience in the city into the technology platform, and that data then gets used for advocacy either at the community level or at the larger level. So one of the things we've done actually in our work communities is we've come up with this concept of the safety chopal, where we actually recognize that an individual woman or an individual young person may not have access to their own mobile phone. So what we do is we try and get a group of women together, or a group of young women together, and with one tablet or one phone, which is usually possible. You will find at least one, or if there's an NGO that works in that area, they can this thing, and they collectively input data. So you're also, challenging the idea that it's a very personal experience only. It's actually a collective experience, and a lot of women, feel it that way. So we found that, when women go out in these groups, it's very interesting because not only do they feel a sense of empowerment, being able to walk through the community with this, safety audit tool, where they are then being seen differently by the community because they are then doing that audit. And I'll give you one very interesting example we had done a few years ago, where we were auditing public community toilets in one neighborhood in Delhi. And just the fact that 3 times a week, the women would go outside the community toilet and audit it to see, is there a person outside, has it been cleaned? What is the nature of infrastructure? That itself put a anxiety in the officials, who then started coming regularly to do the work. So it can become a tool in the hands of women, young people from low-income neighborhoods, to really get their perspective onto a more mainstream platform. And I think that is the kind of role that we have tried to play, without really looking at the technology in itself as the answer to something. But it is a way of giving voice in some cases. The way you present your data, if you use technology and this thing, it's also a very powerful way of showing how unequal things are to this thing. Because really, when you take data and go to your policymakers, they listen much more, right? So it is a voice, it is the quantitative data, a qualitative data, and the narratives, but it is also the numbers. And when you bring numbers and say, this is the issue, and these many women feel this, and these many communities, there is a lack of services, or there's no bus that goes to, except for once in the morning and once in the evening, to this community, and therefore people can't go to work. You are actually, I think, harnessing data and technology to amplify voices. Not other way. So I would say it's a mixed blessing, as always, and one must tread lightly with the recognition of inequality, so the digital divide does not actually become worse and further marginalize women's perspectives.
Thank you, Kalpana. I think, Shilaji, I have a last question for you, and then I'll open it up. I hope everyone's okay. They don't mind staying more than a few minutes extra because we are running short on time. But Shilaji, I think, Kalpana was talking about communities coming together, right? Girls and women coming together, using technology, sharing, right? In order to kind of input data collectively. In your experience, working in homegrown settlements or working with pavement dwellers, how do you see the community coming together to support each other during times of crisis? The absence of formal service provision through kind of some of the policies we've already talked about. And if that's been successful, what else can we do their capacities, right, to come together collectively?
So first of all, crisis is every day in every poor person's life. And they would not have survived hadn't done something collectively. So let's not pretend that people are upper class people are atomized. Communities are not atomized. But as Kalpana and Divya said, so long interventions don't have a clear gendered perspective, it remains gender neutral and therefore doesn't work for people. So definitely creating collectives of women, giving them knowledge about systems, demonstrating to them the power of data. About data. There is nothing that we do start with data. What is your personal experience? What is your collective experience? What is the aggregation of this, and how do you represent it? This is fundamental, and it is done for themselves and their neighborhoods. And the important thing of this, it demonstrates to the men and the other women who may not be part of the organization that this collective doesn't work only for its own benefit, neighborhood. And the power comes from that. There is nothing more powerful than aggregation. So when a bunch of women, like for me, water and sanitation is a man can go piss anywhere. A woman can't. Started working on water and sanitation. We began to look at ratios, how in every public toilet, there were only 2 toilets for women and 6 for men and 5 urinals. This is valuable. So in all the public toilets now have a national policy for, there's equal number for men, equal number for women, and separate for children. Because when fight for a toilet, out, and then they go and shit outside. So these are the observations that women have taught us. So they have the knowledge. They need to be recognized and given voice to that. And they have to become part of the solution that the neighborhood aspires to. See, women's empowerment just doesn't come by saying we want it. It comes out of women transforming the way they think of themselves, the way others think of them, and how what others think of them empower them. So data, skills, problem solving, and becoming mentors to other women. You can't start a movement by people like you and me going into slums every day. But an empowered woman can transform 500 others. Because if a slum woman who is illiterate, uneducated can do it, then other women say, I can do it too. And the last thing I want to say is that the home is designed, protected, managed by women. Yet how many of us actually talk to women about habitat issues? We don't. We sit in a group and the noisy people are the men who want everybody else to do things for them. But the women say, if we understood how to do this differently, we could have done it in another way. So for instance, right now, I'm part of setting up a global campaign called Roof Over Our Heads, which is based on the data that 50% of all informal dwellings are designed, constructed, and financed by people themselves. This is, if you aggregate the quantum of this investment, it's more than all the real estate people's business. But we don't look at it, we don't support them, we don't create incremental mechanisms, our educational systems do that, and we don't put women at the center of it. So our whole process within ARC and NSTF and Mahila Milan, but also globally as Slum Dwellers International, because we are a part of a global network, it is women-centered. And it takes every single problem and challenge that poor people face from a woman's perspective, because a woman's perspective always takes care of the children and it always takes care of the community. And therefore, you don't do it for the sake. So the transformation is both a means and an end. And women, poor women understand that. They don't want talk and they don't want, they don't want to sort of discuss it. They want demonstrated evidence that their changed behavior will change their environment. And I think that if we start with women, and we always say, our women say, we are marathon runners, the men are 100-meter dashers. Fed up after some time and they give up, but women don't give up. So that's my message to you.
Thank you so much, Sheelaji, and thank you to all of you for your insightful comments and thoughts. I know we're just about out of time. We have one question. So maybe if y'all don't mind, we can quickly take a look and then wrap up. I'm guessing this question is for all of you, and it's about for Greenfield Townships settlements. And so for those people who are not planners in the room, for new settlements, right? They're not infill, not rebuilding other communities, but completely new cities, new neighborhoods. How do we put in livable communities? Economically disadvantaged segments? Are there any good cases for reference? So, have any of you, do you have any references or any ideas for how we center vulnerable communities, girls, women, when we're thinking about new cities, new neighborhoods? I'll let anyone respond who has any thoughts or comments.
Quickly start and say there are no such great places, because planners are most gender neutral and negative, deeply negative about informality. I think planners need to be transformed. If you think that, I don't, my colleague who was a slum dweller would say that planners plan and we destroy their plans because we don't talk to each other. So I think that there is no thing, because we do not look at the relationship between the formal and the informal. We don't look at ways by which we will never have total income and mobility and financial equity everywhere. But if we acknowledge the dependency, we acknowledge the need for the whole city to evolve and grow, then you'll plan differently. But if you start off with only saying, how am I going to create real estate that's very, very expensive, so it is politically easy to raise money for the Greenfield Center. This is how all planning starts. So I have very little faith in planners doing anything about this. I'm sorry.
And I can just add to it very quickly. So in terms of, although as Sheilaji was saying that there are very few greenfield large projects, I mean city planning projects, but there are definitely smaller greenfield projects, real estate projects. And as per law, for example, there has to be a percentage that is to be left for development of economically weaker sections, homes and accommodation in some of these real estate projects. That's one. The other way to do this is through the instrument of mixed land use planning. So when we allow mixed land use, we not only allow different types of land use coming together, and it helps in it is a market process, but it helps in seeing that different types of mixed uses are there so that people don't have to travel too far a distance. But it also allows a different type of communities to come together and start living in the vicinity. For example, the house helps that are around our houses, or the ecosystem partners, as we call it, that run our houses or that support our households. This is just one example. The second example could be construction workers. And the question itself says that these communities get a chance to come together and live closer to some of areas. And this phenomena not only works well for greenfield development, but it also works well for the cities that are developing. So secondary cities graduating to class 1 cities, or small towns graduating to medium towns. So this is how, in one way, it can be tackled there.
I just to add, I agree with Divya on that point that it is extremely important. But I think the bigger issue that we are facing today in our urbanization, because greenfield cities are actually being planned for largely the elite. And more and more, the elite of the country do not interact with public services, do not keep out any interclass interaction. We are becoming a really divided society. So, I think unfortunately, a lot of the greenfield cities go the same. Because who are you building it for? It is for the middle, upper middle. So what do you want? They want communities where there are only people like them there, right? You don't really want the other people except to do your the work for you. And then maybe you'll provide some housing for them. And maybe you'll provide some schools for them. But the basic inequality, which is, rooted in a very deep class, feudal, patriarchal system that governs our country, has to be challenged. I mean, I think that the elites are imagining cities is destroying our cities. And I think that is, the more I think about it, I'm convinced we should not be designing the cities. It has to come from people who've not traditionally been designing cities. Because more and more, the elite only wants to keep out everybody else. They don't want to interact with people who are not like us. And I think that is a change even the past 20 years. Even if you were not lower middle class, you did not have the option of not interacting with other people. It's becoming more and more possible in a city like Gurgaon, in parts of Bangalore, in this thing. And my fear is that greenfield cities have the same vision. How do we make it best for us? And therefore, it's not going to happen in an organic way.
I think, there was only one question. Thank you all for your responses. And I know I've kept everyone a little bit longer than we had agreed, so thank you so much. I think it's been a really insightful discussion. And one of the key takeaways is really that we need to start centering vulnerable communities, put them at the heart of our decision-making, understanding them as the main users of infrastructure, and their lived experiences, and their perspectives are really brought to the forefront, whether we're thinking about greenfield development, new neighborhoods, new development, or we're thinking about retrofitting the existing cities. And I'm just going to quickly wrap up. Please,
Let's not use the
absolutely.
word vulnerable. Let's use the word excluded, marginalized.
Yeah.
It's purposefully exclude vulnerable because of any inherent nature, and I think we should stop using marginalized, excluded. Let's find words which, called a spade a spade. Thanks.
That's a very good idea.
Definitely. Very good point. Thank you so much, Kalpana. So yeah, with that, I think I'll wrap up. Vikram, anything left? Anything you'd like to add? Or
No, I think thank you very much. Yeah, nothing further from me. Thank you so much. Bye.
really appreciate your time. Thank you so much, everyone.
Thank you. Bye-bye.
Thank you. Bye-bye.
Bye, everybody.
Bye-bye, Sheila. Bye, Divya. Bye,
Bye-bye.
Shani.